Hi guys, welcome back to my channel and to today's video where I'm going to give you a few short tips and techniques on how you can draw your own penguin. So we'll be covering some white and some black feathers, so if that's something that you're looking for, then carry on watching. Before we get into the video, if you want to follow along with the real-time in-depth video, it's 2.5 hours long, then you can find that over on my Patreon page or over on my website. As I said, it's a 2.5 hour tutorial where we go step by step in real time, so I'm going to leave the link in the description for both of those options for you. This tutorial and this drawing was actually from my own reference photo, which made a very nice change. I enjoyed working from my own rather than from Pixabay. And as you can see here, I'm actually going into the eyes. I'm not going to cover the eyes in depth because I have done that a lot on my channel before, so I'm going to leave a link in the description for a couple of eye videos if you want to see the techniques for getting like the smooth surface and everything. And I do actually have a free draw along workshop next week. You can find that on my channel as well. I'm going to leave a link in the description for that too, where we'll be drawing a cat eye for that as well. So I'm going to give you some tips for eyes on those videos. What we're going to focus on here is pretty much just the feather and getting that kind of beak texture. So on this particular penguin, it's a Humboldt penguin, and this one's name was actually Hurricane. I photographed him myself and he was adorable and I just wanted to work from him. He had this pink kind of skin-like texture around his beak and before he got onto his feathers, so this is what I wanted to add in first. So all I've done is put down a base layer of ivory and then worked over some light flesh, or some beige red as it's called now in the Polychromos range. Used a very light hand and used shading back and forth, and also blended a lot with the white pencil. So in order to get that super smooth surface, I have just shaded and then blended with the white pencil and some lighter tone pencils as well. I think I actually used some warm grey 1 to help blend and some ivory, and I've also layered in some orange tones in there to really convey a kind of orange sense. It just adds a little bit more to the pink in this particular case here. And there was like a little pocked detail, like where he's got some kind of almost like deep pores that you'd find on like an older person's skin, that kind of thing. And I've just used a sharp pencil, made sure I got a really nice sharp point on my pencil, and then gone in and made really tiny little detail marks, so some really tiny small circles, just pretty much just pointing the pencil down with quite a hard pressure and adding that in. And then if there were any instances where I've gone in a little bit too hard and they're a little bit too noticeable, I've just blended over with some of those lighter pencils, just help to tone it down and blend it into the rest of the area that I'd already added around there. So the dark feathers around the top of the head, I've actually gone in with a light base like I usually do, because these feathers were quite reflective and you could see like some of the lighter highlights and everything in there. So I've actually gone in with a warm grey 1. I've used a little bit of a cold grey 1 as well in a few places, and then I've just gone straight in with my darker tones. So I've kind of avoided going in with a lot of mid-tones and just kind of gone in with some greys, some darker greys, some Payne's grey, and then gone in with some walnut brown. And you can see I've kind of added in some red tones and orange tones into the black feathers as well, and I've done that so that I can help to tie in the colour scheme from that pink area around the beak and everything, and followed those pink tones through to the black feathers. And the black feathers in this case were actually quite warm in tone as well, so adding in those browns and those pinks just really helped to complement those warm tones that I could see showing through there. As you can see on this bit around the bottom of the beak, it's a little bit cooler in tone. You can see that I'm just going in with a bit more of a blue toned grey. It's actually a Payne's grey that I've gone in, and I think I've used a little bit of dark indigo as well. And then it kind of blends out into some warmer toned feathers. And for that I've used the browns like I've used on the top of the head there. For the actual technique of the feathers, what I've done is just put down a base layer. Again, I've used a shading motion, and for this I have actually followed the direction which the feathers are flowing down the penguin. So if you look at the form of the penguin, you'll often see that they kind of follow the shape. So these ones in particular that I'm adding on the left hand side were kind of coming down towards the right hand side, and they kind of shifted direction and kind of followed the bird down, so they just ended up going kind of straight down in the end. But as you can see, I'm just kind of shading back and forth, just building up the layers. I've got that initial layer of some ivory I've used, then I've gone straight in with some walnut brown and I think some burnt umber as well for those warmer tones. As I said, these were warmer toned feathers. And then I'm just building in some darker colours on top, so using some Payne's Grey, some dark indigo, because that dark indigo works really nicely with browns and creates a really unique dark tone, rather than going in and just using straight up dark sepia. And I have actually gone in and used dark sepia, and I've used a really hard pressure to get some kind of texture going on. So if you're observing penguins and they're kind of got the wet kind of slick feathers, there's not too much definition and there's not too many details that you can actually add into the feathers. So you do kind of end up with like these really dark, kind of dense looking areas that don't really have any interest to them, and it can be quite daunting and like difficult to portray. But I like to go in and just kind of use the texture of the paper to add everything in. So I'm shading all of the layers down, and then as I get up to the darker colours, just using a slightly harder pressure and adding in some darker areas and kind of smoothing everything out. But as you can see in the dark feathers, not everything is completely like 100% smooth. You've got that texture of the paper showing through, which really adds to the texture of the feathers in this case. The easiest part of this particular drawing was actually the white feathers. I've literally just put down a couple of base layers. I've used some warm grey 1 and I've used some ivory. As you can see, there's kind of warm and cooler tones in different areas around here. The warmer tones I've used the ivory, and then in the cooler tones I've just used a warm grey 1. It is a warm pencil, being a warm grey 1, but it's not as warm as the ivory, which is really quite nice here. And then on top of that, I've just gone in and used a darker grey. I think I used a warm grey 2, and then just added in a few details. And then I've also used the browns and a few of the burnt umbers. That's what I used there, some burnt umber, and then also dragged through some of the Payne's Grey, which are going into the darker feathers to add in those little kind of dark feathers that you can see flecked through the white feathers there. But I've used exactly the same technique for that area of just shading back and forth, and pretty much all of those white feathers around the neck there were just shaded down. And then there's a few little lines. I've just used fur lines here because the feathers were quite short and they were kind of really stuck together. Just use some fur lines to add in a little bit of texture through there. So the area of the wing on the left here is where we do actually go in and have a little bit more detail. So again, I've just used my base layer and I've shaded in the direction that the feathers are going. And then I've added down a little bit of brown for that warmth, and then I'm just going straight in with some Payne's Grey and some dark sepia, and as you can see I'm just kind of using a harder pressure and really adding down that colour. And then I'm going in with another layer of brown before going in with a lot more of a harder pressure and kind of using those fur lines once again. Those were really useful for creating the texture in these particular feathers, and kind of making like little pockets of this lighter tone coming through. So I've used some hard pressure with a sharp dark sepia pencil and kind of added in like little areas of dark and not really connected all of the fur lines together. So I've kind of made like a little mosaic out of some of these darker lines, and then there's these areas of lighter colour within these little darker bits. And for those lighter areas I've actually gone in and used one of my Holbein soft white pencils to really pick those out. And as you can see, it kind of makes it look like the tips of the feathers on the wing there are kind of flecked with white, which was perfect. It gives this really nice texture. It makes it look like it's like a nice salt and pepper texture. And all I've done for that, as I said, is just made sure that I haven't connected a lot of the fur lines together. So rather than like going all over the area and adding in some little fur lines, I've just kept little pockets of these darker colours in certain areas, and then just gone in with the lighter colours in there as well. On the chest of the bird, I've just done exactly the same thing as around the face, and I've also added in some of those Holbein soft white lines to give that kind of flecked appearance. But basically all I've just done is added in the base layer and then gone straight in with my darker tones. So there were hardly any kind of mid-tones for this particular drawing here, which I quite enjoyed. It was quite a nice process, and it was quite quick and, you know, quite a speedy process, as this tutorial, as I said, was only like a 2.5 hour in total, so I actually sped through it pretty quickly. The beak was the hardest part of this because the top half of the beak was actually like a rocky canyon. It had a lot of dark grooves and everything in there, and it did look a little bit daunting. The underside of the beak was quite smooth. It just required a lot of layers and shading and making sure that everything was blended out nicely with a white pencil, so everything was nice and smooth. So the important thing here is to make sure that you add a lot of layers down and you blend with your other pencils in order to create a nice smooth appearance. So with the feathers, I didn't really go in and blend with a white pencil so much because I wanted that kind of furry effect. Whereas the beak, you want it nice and smooth, so you just want to build up a lot of light layers and you want to blend with a white pencil so that you kind of get that smooth look, and you can see just how different the textures are from the beak to the feathers. The top half of the beak was a different story. I made sure that I went in and added a few of the darker areas first in this kind of rocky canyon kind of effect. I've put down a base layer and then I've just gone straight in with a darker tone. I think I used a Payne's grey, and as you can see I'm just kind of outlining all of the darker areas, all of the shadows that I can see on the reference picture. And then what I'm doing is going back into the lighter tones and then just slowly building up to those darker tones again, making sure that I work around those darker lines that I initially put down and making sure that I shade around them so that they're not just like a straight dark area. When you have a darker area like that, it tends to have a little bit of shading around it and then some lighter areas surrounding as well. So I'm just making sure that I shade some of those darker areas in so that they're not just so abrupt and like in your face and just a dark line on there. Just blending them in and working over a lot of the mid-tones and some of the lighter and darker colours as well. There weren't very many mid-tones in the feathers, but for the area of the beak and everything there were quite a few mid-tones going down. So all it took here was just a lot of shading, a lot of blending, making sure that everything's nice and smooth, especially on the underside of the beak. The top side of the beak didn't really matter if it wasn't too smooth because you kind of got that kind of really ridged effect and it was kind of rough looking. But in order to create that kind of rough looking texture, I did kind of zigzag my pencil a little bit and kind of exaggerate the kind of rocky, crusty kind of feeling of the beak. And as I said, just put down the darker areas first and then worked back in with my lighter pencils, working all the way back up to the dark and making sure I add in all of the shadow areas and keeping all of the kind of highlighted areas as bright as possible. And if there were any areas that needed re-highlighting, I've used my Holbein soft white pencil to go in there and add that. If you don't have a Holbein soft white, by the way, which I do recommend you go and get if you don't have one because it is a magnificent pencil, but if you don't happen to have one or it's too expensive to add to your kit, then a white gel pen or like a slice craft blade or something like that you can use to lift the colour out of an area is just as good here. But that is pretty much it for a few short techniques on how to draw your own penguin. I really hope that you enjoyed these and found some of them useful. As I said, the full real-time thing is available over on Patreon. I go into a lot more depth, obviously, and we're doing it in real time, so I'm kind of holding your hand along with you as you're drawing this, because some of the textures can be a little bit tricky on this to explain in kind of short terms for YouTube. I'm trying my best with this one, but yeah, if you want to follow along with the real time thing, then please hop along to Patreon and subscribe over there. There's a whole bunch of other tutorials as well. Pretty much all of my kind of YouTube backlog is either on Patreon and my website as well, so yeah. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this one and I hope that you have learned a few kind of techniques to doing beaks and kind of feathers with this kind of texture, and I'll see you guys in the next tutorial. Bye!